another beautiful day, and we can say thank you to the faithfulness of the Lord for another beautiful day reflecting on theological education. So I just want to say thank you very much to the organizing committee for inviting me to speak on formative education. Formation, what is this? Formation is about the process of becoming. Galatians 4:19, Paul says, until Christ is formed in you. So here the word formed suggests that the inner being of a person is radically altered so that he or she is no longer the same. So in theological education, formation is when students are shaped by a complex interrelation between what they think, what they experience, and what they do. And Edward Farley, who's written that seminal text, Theologia, he calls this theologia, this integration, this bringing together of theory, theory with practice as theologia rather than theology, to underline that it is a special kind of wisdom, a way of being human. This happens between the process of reflection, and sometimes I think we do not reflect on practices enough in theological education. It happens through various aspects of growth and development and through internalization. So as we said, Africa needs new approaches and pedagogical change to move away from this traditional Western curriculum. And as a practical theology, my method of doing theology is to describe human practices as they are, imagining how they could be, and seek to transform or design practices to shape particular outcomes. So essentially, practical theology is a design process. Here I quote Daniel Alshire, and many of you may know him. He was the head of the Association of Theological Schools in the US for about 20 years. And he says, the next theological education, the one needed for the future that is coming, will need to be more formational than the current version, and that formation will need to make spiritual maturity, moral integrity, relational ability more central than they have been in the past. So what is the future of theological education as formation? Is this maybe a US problem? Is it for us in Africa? Do we need spiritual, moral, and relational competency in our graduates? So this is what we're going to unpack today. So I've just got 5 slides. I'll try and keep to the time. And I will unpack what formation is, how it could look like, what is the value, and what our challenges are in Africa. But before I get there, I would like to tell you a story. We all like stories. I would like to share how I was trained in seminary and why I have focused on formation of all things. So I was called to ministry in 1989. I went to seminary in 1991 to an evangelical seminary. Of course, in those days, I'm from South Africa, so in those days of apartheid, you couldn't walk up to any university. It was all decided for you by your skin color. And the one university that I could go to as an Indian person did not have theology. We were limited in our options. And at that time, our country was going through incredible political turmoil. In 1990, Nelson Mandela, February 1990, was released from prison. We really didn't know what was coming. There was a lot of violence in black areas. The third force, and many of the South Africans here will be able to relate it. And for me, going to seminary, I was wondering, what was this going to be about? And so I went to the evangelical seminary in Pietermaritzburg, and we had, it was multicultural. We had to have special permission to exist. Of course, all our racially, we could not live together in those days, so we had to get the city permission. So it was a multicultural student body, and it was for me an incredibly rich time of learning, because it was the first time I was engaging with a white person, with a black person, with a colored person. You know, our development was so separate. We really didn't understand the other. We just relied on the stereotypes. And at that time as well, I had the good privilege of learning ecumenically. So what does that mean? We had 5 seminaries, accredited schools, linked together. Our libraries were linked together. We had shared classes, lectures. So I learned spirituality from the Catholics. So I went up, we all went up with a van to St. Joseph's on the Hill. And I learned liberation theology at the local public university, the University of Natal, Pietermaritzburg, social justice from the Anglican House of Studies. And as evangelicals, we offered courses on intercultural communication, missiology, and the like. So it was a very rich learning experience. And as we experienced this political instability, not knowing what was coming next, this became the material we wrestled with in the theological classroom. Problem-based learning, and we were also, as a seminary, involved in all kinds of social action. You remember the church struggle against apartheid, and the church was a key player in birthing democracy. And so this was a really rewarding time of interaction and learning from other traditions, widening our horizons on the worldwide church, and also wondering what the new South Africa could look like. And as we worked out our agency, our identity, studying and living in community, it was held together by a formative vision. And that formative vision was the motive of God's shalom. We heard that at every turn, Isaiah 26:3. Personal peace, wholeness, reconciling our own identity to what has happened to us as a country and to each other. It was deeply personal. And through habitual ways of being, through the formal, the informal curriculum, the quality of interaction shaped who we were, our character. And in the safe space, we struggled with each other. We processed the issues. I remember in our process meetings, our chaplain would process, we would sit in a circle, and then we would show solidarity with this marginalized but, privileged white male. And we would show solidarity or the angry black youth for the oppression. And we really wrestled with these issues. And it provided a foundation for humanizing the other, our education. And we dealt with our lived realities of race, of poverty, of oppression. And this has provided me with a vision of what is possible in theological education, that we can all be humanly united under the cross. And this formative model that I lived out with the commitment of the institution, of the educators, the faculty, I think could have tremendous potential in theological education. So moving on, what do we actually understand by formation? It comes from the Latin word formosus, meaning bringing out the beauty of each person, and is explained in the Vatican II document as true education that aims at the formation of the person in the pursuit of their final end and for the good of society. In other words, formation is about the process of becoming. It refers to a change in being. Formation taken with the word transformation. Of course, the word formation has different meanings in different settings. It is largely adapted from the monastic tradition of forming priests, and the Catholic tradition has a sacramental conception of ministry as priesthood, and they have clear institutional goals for formation, and they have 4 types of formation, namely human formation, intellectual formation, spiritual, and pastoral. And the human one, which is a little bit unique in this case, deals with sexuality as they take their vows of celibacy. So Protestants usually have three major areas of looking at formation: the intellectual, the skills development, the spiritual or the character formation. And in higher education, formation hovers around the integration of three aims: the preparation for work, the development of analytical and critical reflection, and the induction into a culture of ongoing and creative learning. So formation has developed from the early classical Greek education. The name given to the desired pedagogical outcome was paideia, meaning schooling, culturing, education or training of the whole person, virtue education. And it is about learning to achieve the ultimate goal, which is knowing God. Not just knowing information about God, but it is about a certain kind of wisdom. Knowledge is the way to wisdom and a true knowing of God. Of course, with the Enlightenment and the German Berlin model, we found a shift to a more functionalistic, a rationalistic, individualistic way of studying theology. And we have the Encyclopedia of Theology and the fourfold curriculum of Bible, history, dogmatics, and practical theology, which saw theology as separate from a context of faith. With mission Christianity and the legacy of colonialism, this fragmented fourfold curriculum has now come to us in Africa. It is the universal model, the dominant model worldwide. More recently, there has been a move towards formative education where the students' personal appropriation of theology is central. This process is not something that is done to the students, but rather it is a cooperative, holistic, and intentional journey with the student, with the enabling resources of the educators who carry a mandate to provide the link between education and ministry formation. Can we have the next slide, please? So here I ask the question, in terms of definition, why is there not more intention towards holistic education? Why does the academic paradigm dominate when it comes for training for ministry? So in this project, when we went to seminaries, all the schools that we sampled, the 3 schools, all in their mission statement stated that they train holistically. But when we scratched and looked at their curriculum, that was not the case. It was a nice marketing slogan that they use. Yes, we train holistically, but it's purely an academic loaded with biblical and systematic theology. Essentially, every book in the Bible, I don't know why, but it is there. I'm not a biblical scholar, but you see this quite commonly. So we talk about these intentions of holistic education, but in practice, it's hard to find. So why is it so puzzling? So when we look at the value of formative education, of course, our education is different because it's tied to calling, it's tied to vocation. And here knowledge is highly embodied and contextual. It is always a subjective activity. As Cahalan states, knowing is about the embodied and the embedded self in knowing. So studying theology is fundamentally personal. It's concerned with meaning, with purpose, with identity. So the training experience is about occupational and personal identity for ministry. And in some traditions, it is about pragmatically crafting a well-constructed self-image for the pastor. It's about performance, it's about the external. Yet formation must be about a kind of shaping where students are formed to be a particular kind of person. It is about developing inner coherence and authenticity. And when we think of Christian ministry and the temptations of power and the ample opportunity of deception, and when we look at clergy dysfunction and misconduct in Africa. I'm sure you can relate many incidents. We wonder, how did these people come to be that have gone through the process of theological education? But when we see the fraud, the sexual abuse, the financial scandals in the church, we are amazed and we wonder, what kind of training have they received? So the value of this method is that it engages with the life world of the student and it connects to their lived experience. And we heard a lot about African realities and connecting to the African experience. Classical theological method has always looked to scripture, to tradition, to reason. And they have found the person largely irrelevant. Yet values, memories, experiences are key to students' theologizing and their conceptual work. Students do have a wealth of life experience, which is a rich resource for learning and used in knowledge production. So educators will have to take the experiences of students seriously and help them to access knowledge by reflecting on their social location and their identities for their theological construction, to see how they are predisposed to think about issues from their particular location. Of course, the geographical positioning speaks to a particular social and political position as well. And here students can build from cultural knowledge and not from some abstract classical theoretical framework, which could be Western and disconnecting from their social context. Students also reclaim aspects of culture by learning from their histories, reclaiming what is lost or unknown to them, and reframing what is often viewed negatively to be seen more positively. So as in my example, the formative learning community is an opportunity for students to unlearn, to learn, and to relearn. This deconstructive, reconstructive model is inherently transformative as students recreate their worldview and their theology, which leads to an expansion of consciousness. Students become grounded with coherent ministerial identity, and the student emerges as one who is becoming, always a work in progress, destined to change and grow. Formation also as a concept is in line with the African worldview of holism, where education is about the development of the whole person as opposed to just accumulating knowledge. It helps individuals to live more consciously within a communal ethic born out of a focus on African values and spirituality, focused on the importance of personhood and community as key principles. You know, theological education is very individualistic and does not work with the community principle of the African worldview. So can we have the slide on that one? And the question here that I would like to ask is, why is the life world of the student or a student-centered paradigm not fully embraced? Why is our education still focused on teaching and not enough on learning? And when we went to schools, this is something else we found. It was all about the teacher. Sorry, can you go one back? Yes. Why is the student-centered paradigm not fully embraced? Why is our education still focused on teaching and not enough on learning? When we went into our sampled institutions, this is what it was all about: the lecturer, the lecturer's content, their teaching material, and them being the expert. Is this tied to our African culture of our elders? And there's not enough almost respect given to the student. And of course, the paradigm shift has been made in education to student-centered learning. But we found in our sample institutions, our 3 African institutions, this was not the case. So what is our current reality of theological education in Africa? Many speakers have already mentioned a lot about this. In Africa, the colonial education system has alienated the African from his or her culture. Mugambi notes that most pastoral training has been conducted by missionaries who know little or nothing about the inner dynamics of the African cultural and religious heritage. Akong and others like Ella are critical of the dualistic mindset brought on by the dominant missionary salvation paradigm of inclusion and exclusion that creates a definition of salvation in terms of separation, distancing, and the rejection of African culture because it was deemed to be primitive, devilish, and therefore incompatible with the Christian life. So scholarship in African Christianity has showed the need to rehabilitate African cultures. And we've heard that from the first presentation. Bediako brings to our awareness an appreciation of the primal imagination, a connection to God, one another, and the earth that is good. He was more concerned on revelation on cultural forms that appreciated culture. By looking at the underlying factors that shape culture, not simply the cultural artifacts, but by acknowledging God's sovereignty in revelation and human frailty in receiving revelation. So this provides tools for discerning and appreciating God's self-revelation through various cultural forms, looking for revealed meaning and insight rather than dismissing it if it's not found in the scriptures. So scholarship in African Christianity has shown the need to give voice and establish distinctly African approaches to its field of endeavor, to see it working to serve the common good of the continent, looking at social, economic, political, not just the issues of the church, but impacting the continent. Decoloniality as a perspective focuses on coloniality of knowledge, coloniality of being, and coloniality of power. In the case of coloniality of knowledge, it focuses on teasing out the epistemological issues, the politics of knowledge generation, as well as questions of who generates which knowledge and for what purpose. The calls to decolonize the Western curriculum means more than just teaching the inclusion of African issues or adding a few African scholars here and there, or a simple reclustering of subjects, but it involves the unreflected cultural, epistemological, and denominational suppositions and attitudes that are sustained. So in theological education then, the social context should be a major element to be examined, where asserting other knowledges, African knowledge, creates the possibility that people can break free from the way a discourse has defined them. Can we have this next slide? So here I would like to ask the question, the next one, please go back. What are we doing to decolonize harmful patterns of relating built into persons, interpersonal relationships, and communal and institutional identities? So maybe we could discuss it when we have the question and answer session. Okay, let us move on. So what does Africa need in terms of leadership development then? So Abraham Akong argues that the goal of theological education in Africa must be to prepare the church as an agent of change that brings possibilities of hope and new life in the midst of the distortions of life, destruction, and death. Scholars like Akong and Kwame Abedeko have called for a credible theological paradigm that provides its context with the conceptual framework, the language, and the lexicon from which new hermeneutical principles could be developed to address new questions, concerns, and challenges. In this sense, theological paradigms provide the core theory and auxiliary theories from which the central message of Christianity can be related to new challenges and issues in different, like in African cultural and historical contexts. Tete Tino as well as reflected extensively on the need to attend fully to present-day African realities, and he has written about Christianity's correlation with its African context, which must be cardinal. And also the need for theologians' best ideas for ministry and witness in and through the church to reach out to pastors and lay leaders on the ground. So he is asking for a closer look between theory formation and actual practice. So formative education can be helpful here to create the connections between the Christian message, the cultural heritage, the connections between theory and practice. It involves a conscientization process which allows students to reflect on their social location and identity construction, which is a movement from confrontation of the system to self-awareness to re-articulation. Consequently, the humanizing power of education is given its proper place. So, how then do we engage with this whole notion of formative education? Edwin Aponte, he reminds us, I like him, he says, we must undo the encyclopedia of theological education because it is unredeemably colonial. So we have moved from the clerical paradigm into this academic paradigm, this Berlin model, this fourfold curriculum of Bible theology, church history, pastoral education, and all the ideology of the Enlightenment. And these silos, which we constantly maintain, it does not help us to deal with the life situations, the needs, the skills that the students need. It is fragmented. And much of our education is about textual interpretation and doctrinal exposition rather than on the contextual needs. And this disciplinary education as well, this knowledge, is quite diversified. I know in our university, we have about 80 professors, and we have the biggest faculty in theology in South Africa, possibly in Africa. We have about 80 professors. So as a practical theologian, my major is education, Christian education, religious, theological education. I do not know anything about pastoral care. I don't know anything about worship. I don't know anything about liturgy. Because my discipline, my sub-discipline is so loaded. This is what we are dealing with. So we are so diversified that we are no longer able to converse meaningfully with one another. Each discipline has its own methodology, its own language. The focus has become critical scholarship, which makes criticism the virtue that is being rewarded. Isn't that so? This is what higher education is about. In addition, there is little motivation or structural arrangement to connect around the common goal of ministerial training. For example, courses on pastoral actions are taught in isolation instead of having greater connection with other sub-disciplines to show the overlap and the interconnectedness of ministry. Students are generally not asked to reflect on the ministry challenges or what they learn in internships. Practical ministry, we found in this project, is mostly unsupervised in Africa. Students are sent to the church to do something. They don't bring that learning back to the classroom. They don't reflect on what the practice is. So what kind of learning is really happening, you wonder. So students are often not able to see these connections with all these disciplines, but somehow they must make this connection in ministry. So formative education can provide the synthesis, this coordination that's needed between the academic, this pastoral, the skills, by intentionally combining the curriculum, the extracurricular activities, the integrations of theological disciplines. Do you know of MIT collaboration, multi-inter-transdisciplinary collaboration? We also have the integration between theory and practice. And the best way to teach theology is to invite students to do theology by participating in the theologizing process, using contextual learning theory, In this way, grassroots theology is developed. So formation involves education that focuses on the whole teaching learning situation, and a teaching learning strategy is adjusted to meet the needs of the learner, the teacher, the situation, in an effort to attain educational outcomes. Can we have the next slide, please? So it begins, how do we start this journey? It begins with an appropriate educational philosophy. It is about having a clarity of purpose. What is this institution about? That gives direction to the curriculum and educational practices. We also need to work backward. What is the product of our theological education? What do we want to create in the learner? And this picture shows that we have to, it's backward design, saying if we want this moral individual, if we want the spiritual individual, a competent person in ministry, what do we need to then build into our curriculum? Some institutions have done away with the fourfold division and have moved to programs and thematic courses. There's an excellent book called Integrating Work by Kathleen Cahalan and with Gordon Molonsky and Edward Foley, and they were part of a Lilly Foundation grant that gave schools in ATS schools money to reflect on integrative projects. And that book is written up, all those practices, so if you want to look at that. But the Acrofi Chrysler Institute, as also already mentioned, is a wonderful African example of how they have used a clear interpretive framework to curriculum development, and they've embraced the three areas of theology, mission, and culture. And in this model of theological education, this is a way of becoming a center of cultural affirmation instead of cultural alienation. And by these means could the pressing demands of African Christian identity be addressed and an acceptable, authentic African theology be achieved. The other thing I want to quickly say, I can see my time is almost up, is the issue of outdated pedagogy. And when we went around to schools, we noticed that, as I mentioned, the teacher as the expert. So we need to become more participatory, have better ways of teaching and learning and working with our students. Formation is both a goal and it involves a process. It unfolds over time. It extends beyond the classroom to the community life with a corporate dimension and is the task of the whole faculty. Everyone is involved, like curriculum design. It's not one person's job. It's everyone agreeing. This is our product and this is how we will do it. Thus, the learning environment, the hidden curriculum, the interactions with students and teachers influence the integration of learning and the formation of the student. So we need reform. This is an approach that I think could make a substantial impact, but it requires leadership, it requires intention, it requires vision. We in Africa need to be far more experimental. We need to try things. And I think this is where we fail. We also need more research on good pedagogical methods so that we can scale it to other institutions. So thank you very much for your attention.